Oh, welcome back, sleepy summoner. Relax your body and mind. Let me tell you a story about a boy named Kayn. In the heart of the Empire, where stone streets ran straight and unyielding, a child of Noxus learned his first lessons about power. His name was Kayn, a boy born among the shadowed alleys that lay between barracks and blacksmiths. The walls of the city were high and formidable, but even they could not shut out the feeling that the world was larger, harsher, and waiting beyond. He grew up on stories of conquest, of legions marching out to subdue lands far beyond the horizon. He also grew up under watchful eyes that measured strength and obedience. When the call came for soldiers, no one in his part of the city was surprised that conscription swept through like a gale. The Empire had turned its gaze eastward. Ionia, a place of ancient forests and mystical traditions, had refused to bow. Commanders wanted fresh bodies for a new front. Youths barely old enough to wield the weapons thrust into their hands were lined up, counted, and sent away. Kayn was among them. He had not yet reached adulthood when he felt the weight of an axe pressed into his palms. The iron smelled of oil and charred wood. He looked at his reflection in the blade and saw only determination. Training for the conscripted children was brutal and efficient. Older soldiers barked orders and demonstrations were swift. To survive, the youths learned to mimic, adapt, and follow commands without question. Kayn learned how to heft a weapon, how to strike and parry, and how to endure. He learned that to hesitate meant death. He slept on the cold earth under tents that barely kept out the rain and wind. Night after night, whispers spread among the young recruits. Some lamented homes left behind. Others talked about glory promised by the Empire. Kayn listened, absorbing words but holding his own counsel. He needed to survive, and to survive he would use everything he had. The journey from Noxus to Ionia was long. The Legion marched over plains and through mountain passes. When they finally saw the borders of Ionia, it was like seeing another world. Lush greenery filled valleys, and towering trees seemed to stretch endlessly. The air was thick with the scent of flowering plants and damp earth. Birds with bright feathers flitted through the canopy. Kayn had never seen such abundance. As the soldiers prepared for invasion, he could not help but feel a sense of awe. This place they had come to conquer was beautiful. The sight only strengthened his resolve. If he was to fight, he would fight for survival. He would take what knowledge he could and carve his own destiny. On the front lines, the Empire relied on shock tactics. Child soldiers were sent ahead, their youth intended to disarm the defenders. Commanders calculated that the Ionians' compassion would prevent them from striking quickly. Kayn and others were pushed forward with crude shields, told to scream and rush. They screamed because they were told to, because fear had built up inside them, because the roar of adult soldiers behind them pushed them forward. When Ionian defenders hesitated, uncertain about raising weapons against youths, the full force of the Noxian army struck from behind the child line. In those chaotic moments, Kayn experienced fear and survival as one. His first encounter with death on the battlefield seared itself into his mind. A man with hair the color of silver and robes that shimmered with mystical patterns stood in front of him. The man's eyes were gentle, hands open in a gesture of peace, even as soldiers clashed around them. He spoke words Kayn did not understand. Perhaps they were meant to persuade the boy to put down his weapon. Perhaps They were a prayer. Kayn's training and fear overrode everything else. He thrust his makeshift spear forward. The expression on the man's face shifted from kindness to pain. Blood stained the grass. Kayn stood there, breath ragged, hand trembling on the haft of his weapon. Something inside him hardened, and a part of him whispered that to live, he would need to step into darkness. After the initial victories, the war stretched on. The Empire pressed forward, but Ionian resistance stiffened. Guerrilla fighters struck from the shadows. Mystics used spells that confused and frightened the invaders. The cost was high for both sides. Kayn saw more than one friend fall. He watched as wounded boys were left behind because the column could not slow down. Winter brought cold that seeped into bones and hearts. Through all of it, Kayn kept moving. He learned to scavenge, to rest when he could, to stay alert, and to think 2 steps ahead. Each day he honed his skills. He learned to appreciate the light weight of a blade. He noticed how his small size could be an advantage in narrow paths. He began to think beyond orders and to watch for opportunities. Survival sharpened his focus. In one skirmish near Baal, a village at the edge of a forest, the Empire tried a new tactic. They feigned retreat, then doubled back under cover of night. Child soldiers were instructed to silently infiltrate the village, cause panic, and open the gates for the main force. Kayn crept through underbrush, heart pounding. He could hear murmurs of Ionian families inside their homes. The plan was cruel. As he hid in the shadows, he looked at the moonlight reflecting on the river that passed by the village. He thought about the absurdity of being used this way. Something in him rebelled, not out of compassion, but because he saw that the Empire considered him expendable. Yet he was not expendable to himself. That night he intentionally alerted the defenders in a way that would protect himself. He whispered a warning through a crack in the wall to a woman who pressed her ear to the wood. When the alarm was raised, the Noxian commanders cursed. In the confusion, Kayn slipped away, vanishing into the forest. From that moment on, he was a fugitive. He had no path back to the Empire. He had betrayed his orders to save his own skin. He fled through the undergrowth, not knowing where he would end up. For days he wandered, avoiding patrols. He drank from streams, ate roots and berries, and slept beneath trees. It was then that he first heard the rustle of shadows speaking to him. It was not a voice in words, but a whisper of presence, a sense that the darkness around him held secrets. Hunger, fear, and cold pressed in on him, yet he pushed on. Just when exhaustion threatened to consume him, he encountered a group moving silently among the trees. They wore dark clothes that melded with the night. Their faces were hidden behind masks carved with angular designs. These were not soldiers of the Empire, nor were they dressed like the Ionian defenders he had encountered. They moved with fluidity that belied lethal intent. One of them, cloaked in deeper shadow, stepped forward. A pair of keen eyes studied Kayn. The stranger's voice was low and resonant. He asked the boy why he was in Ionian territory alone. Kayn's reply was simple and defiant. He refused to die for an empire that saw him as a tool. The leader of this shadowed group was Zed. He saw something in Kayn, a spark, a hunger, a ruthless clarity born not of cruelty, but of survival. In the boy's eyes, he saw determination and potential. Zed offered Kayn a choice: continue to run, risking death, or join those who would teach him to harness the shadows rather than fear them. Kayn looked at the darkness swirling around Zed's hands. He thought of the nights when he had felt a presence in the gloom. Without hesitation, he accepted. Joining the Order of Shadow changed Kayn's life. Hidden deep in ancient temples and caves, the Order had formed when Zed and others broke away from traditional Ionian practices. They sought power in techniques that others considered forbidden. Where Ionia worshipped balance, the Order sought decisive strength. Zed believed that mere defense could not stand against threats like Noxus. He believed that, to protect their homeland, they had to embrace the darkness and strike preemptively. The Order trained in secret, away from the gaze of the Kinku and the general population. Kayn was introduced to the Tears of the Shadow, an ancient artifact that gifted its bearers the ability to manipulate shadow itself. He watched as older acolytes extended darkness like a living thing, using it to cloak their movements and strike unseen. The initial lessons were daunting. To manipulate shadow required focus and surrender. One had to let go of fear and allow the darkness to become a part of them. At first, Kayn struggled. He felt the shadow slide away from his grasp like water. But he also felt a pull. He could not deny that something inside him resonated with this power. Zed personally oversaw some of Kayn's training. The master was calm yet intense, his movements precise, his eyes always weighing the worth of what he saw. He did not coddle his students. When he instructed, he expected absolute attention. When Kayn failed to grasp a technique, Zed would demonstrate once, then command him to repeat until his muscles ached. Through physical drills, Kayn learned to move silently, to climb sheer cliffs with bare hands, to fight in close quarters with small blades and staffs. Through meditation, he learned to clear his mind, focus on a single intention, and invite shadows to respond. He discovered that the darkness was not passive. It was a resource waiting to be tapped. As his control grew, he could make his body melt into walls of night. Emerging behind an opponent with a dagger ready, he could create slivers of darkness to distract or misdirect. He could strike and vanish before anyone knew he had been there. The Order was not a monolithic group. There were older disciples, peers, and newcomers. Among them, Kayn found both rivals and companions. Acolytes like Nakuri, Benza, and Taro were already well versed in shadow techniques. Nakuri in particular was disciplined and dedicated. She adhered to Zed's teachings with strict focus and was as skilled with a sword as she was with shadow magic. Benza was more jovial, though his humor masked a steely resolve. Taro was quiet, observant, and preferred the company of blades to people. They trained together, pushing each other, learning to work in teams and alone. Competition was encouraged, for the Order believed that pressure forged strength. As months turned into years, Kayn grew into his skills. He surpassed many in his cohort, absorbing techniques quickly and improvising his own. He experimented with different weapons, from daggers to throwing knives to staffs. None seemed to satisfy him entirely. Each weapon had limitations. He wanted something that could reflect his fluidity, his ability to strike quickly and decisively, his desire to adapt on the fly. Zed noticed this restless search. He challenged Kayn to think beyond the tools. The weapon, he said, was an extension of intention. True mastery came when intention was clear. In between training, Zed spoke to his students about philosophy. He taught that fear could be a tool, that mercy could be weakness if it allowed greater evil to flourish. He spoke of the need for Ionia to rise, to cast off complacency, and to prepare for those who would exploit them. Kayn listened and nodded. Part of him still carried resentment against the empire that had forced him into battle. Another part had seen that compassion could save lives, as when he warned the villagers. Zed's words about balance being insufficient resonated. Yet Kayn also saw that power itself could be corrupting. He was drawn to the idea of forging his own destiny, not simply following orders again. As the Order of Shadow grew stronger, so did the threats around them. Noxus did not cease its incursions. Other powers also took notice of the Order's existence. The Kinku Order, guardians of Ionian balance, disapproved of Zed's methods. They saw the manipulation of Shadow as a corruption. In secret, they watched and planned, but open conflict remained rare. The world was in flux, and all sides sought advantage. Kayn's ambition grew alongside his skills. He no longer saw himself as a soldier following orders. He saw himself as someone who could shape events. He believed that his talent and determination destined him for leadership. He looked at Zed with respect, but also with the thought that one day he might surpass him. He kept those thoughts private, focusing on training and missions, but every time he succeeded in a task that others failed, a small flame of pride burned brighter inside him. That pride was tested when Zed called him and a small group together for a mission unlike any other. Rumors had reached the Order of an ancient weapon uncovered by Noxians in a remote corner of Ionia. The weapon was said to be of Darkin origin. Darkin were legendary beings, part god, part mortal, corrupted by power. Their weapons were legendary and dangerous. The Darkin scythe, unearthed by Noxian excavators, had to be destroyed or claimed before the Empire could use it. Zed selected Kayn, Nakuri, Benza, and Taro for the operation. He chose them for their skills and for their willingness to take risks. The journey to the excavation site took them across landscapes familiar and new. They travelled at night, avoiding patrols and using shadows for cover. Along the way, they saw how the war had scarred the land. Villages stood empty, fields lay fallow, and ancient statues lay toppled. They also saw people rebuilding, planting seeds, and teaching children. The contrast struck Kayn. Ionia was wounded but resilient. He wondered what would happen if the Darkin weapon fell into Noxian hands. He also wondered what it would mean for him if he could wield such a weapon. When they reached the dig site, they observed from a distance. The Noxians had set up a perimeter with guards and watchtowers. Torches burned at regular intervals. The excavation pit was deep, and at the bottom, Kayn could see a metal object half buried in rock. Shadows clung to it, thick and heavy. Even from afar he felt a pull. The weapon seemed to call to something inside him. Zed's instructions had been clear. Destroy or retrieve the scythe. Do not let its power corrupt you. Kayn repeated those instructions in his mind as he and his companions planned their infiltration. They waited until a moonless night when the guards were tired. Benza created diversions on one side of the camp, drawing soldiers away. Taro climbed down the pit to cut through ropes holding the weapon. Nakuri watched the perimeter with eyes like a hawk, ready to intervene. Kayn descended into the excavation with nimble steps, his heart pounding. He reached out to touch the weapon. Cold shot up his arm, along with a flood of sensations. It was as if voices, long buried, whispered to him. The scythe, known as Rhaast, recognized him. It sensed his ambition, his hunger. In that moment, Kayn felt both seen and judged. When Taro approached to assist, he hesitated. The weapon's aura was overwhelming. Nakori signaled that guards were returning. Time was running out. Kayn knew that they could not spend time debating whether to destroy or take the weapon. He had to decide. He thought of power, of destiny. He thought of his long training, of his place in the Order. He decided that no one else should wield this weapon but him. He wrapped his fingers around the scythe's handle. The weapon pulsed. A voice spoke in his mind, deep and ancient, amused and hungry. It said his name as if tasting it. It promised power. It also demanded submission. Kayn drew the scythe from the earth. Taro reached out, perhaps to caution him. In that instant, the weapon's influence surged. Kayn saw visions of ancient battles, of Darkin cutting down armies. He saw rivers of blood, skies roiling with fire. He also saw himself standing above all, scythe in hand, shadows swirling. The voice Rhaast laughed softly. It told him that together they could reshape the world. It told him to let go of his loyalty to anyone but the scythe. Kayn's grip tightened. He stepped away from Taro. Nakori descended quickly, eyes widening when she saw Kayn holding the weapon. She whispered that they had to follow the plan to destroy the scythe. Kayn met her gaze. In that moment, something shifted. He told her that destiny had changed. He tried to persuade her that if they possessed the weapon, the Order would be stronger. She argued that the Darkin was corrupt. The voice in Kayn's mind urged him to silence her. He resisted at first, but Rhaast's presence pressed in, mixing with his own ambition. His hand moved almost on its own. The scythe flashed. Nakori fell, life spilling onto the ancient stones. Shock and horror rippled through Kayn's companions. Benza and Taro froze. Kayn felt a pit open inside him. Part of him screamed that he had done something unforgivable. Another part whispered that he had finally broken free of expectations. He turned to his remaining companions and told them that if they wanted to live, they would help him escape. The weight of his words hung in the air. For a moment, it seemed as if they would attack him. Then Benza nodded grimly. They all knew that they were outnumbered by Noxians. Survival demanded unity, even if it was uneasy. They fought their way out of the dig site, using shadows and surprise to cut through guards. Kayn felt the scythe respond to his movements with ease. It was heavier than any weapon he had used, but it moved as if it anticipated his strikes. Each swing sent arcs of darkness slicing through enemies. Each kill stirred Rhaast, making the voice whisper more insistently. Kayn pushed the voice aside, focusing on the path ahead. As they disappeared into the night, he knew the Order would demand answers. When they returned to the hidden stronghold, Kayn did not attempt to hide what he had done. He stood before Zed, Rhaast in his hand. He explained the mission and the choice he had made. He did not mention every whisper of the Darkin, but he did not deny that he killed Nakori. He framed it as a necessary decision to prevent the weapon from being lost. He claimed that he could master the scythe. Zed listened without interrupting. His eyes were unreadable. After Kayn finished, silence hung between them. Then Zed ordered him to surrender the weapon and to be confined until they could determine whether the Darkin had already taken hold of him. Confined in a dark chamber with only his thoughts, Kayn sat cross-legged with the scythe resting across his knees. The stone walls were cool, the air thick, shadows pooled in corners. He was alone, save for the presence now inside him. Rhaast spoke to him at length. The Darkin spirit taunted him about being locked away, about how the Order feared him. It told him that Zed was hypocritical for using forbidden power, but denying Kayn the right to harness it fully. It whispered stories of the world before it was broken, of battles across deserts and oceans. It offered glimpses of unimaginable power. Kayn listened, but he did not answer. Instead, he meditated as he had been taught. He observed the voice like one observes a stream, noting its currents without jumping in. Days became weeks. Outside, acolytes whispered about Kayn's fate. Some called for his execution, others believed he should be given a chance. Zed visited him occasionally, asking him questions about what he felt, what the voice said. Sometimes Zed would warn him not to trust the Darkin. Sometimes he would sit in silence. Kayn realized that Zed was watching to see if he would succumb. The Scythe's hunger was real. Rhaast wanted more. He asked for blood. He reminded Kayn of the ease with which he killed its enemies. He pointed out the hypocrisy of others. Kayn countered by reminding Rhaast that if he lost control, he would be sealed away or killed. They began an uneasy conversation that would continue for the rest of their shared existence. Eventually, Zed allowed Kayn to resume training under strict supervision. The Order needed his skills, and they needed to know whether he could control the Darkin. Kayn trained with Rhaast in open grounds, under watchful eyes. Each swing of the scythe drew out a whisper. Each kill in practice stirred the Darkin's hunger. Kayn responded by sharpening his focus. He learned to differentiate between his own thoughts and Rhaast's suggestions. He learned that when he allowed his mind to drift, the Darkin would slip in, subtly changing his intentions. To prevent this, he practiced anchor points memories of the forest, of the river, of the faces of those he had promised never to forget. He learned to treat Rhaast like a storm. One does not stop a storm, but one can navigate through it. With time, Kayn regained the trust of some members of the Order. He was sent on missions again, though always with oversight. He used the scythe sparingly at first, favoring his shadow techniques. But as missions grew more dangerous, he began to rely on the weapon's power. Each time he did, he could feel Rhaast's influence strengthening. Sometimes he would hear the Darkin laugh when an enemy fell. Sometimes he felt a surge of satisfaction that was not entirely his own. After each mission, he meditated and argued with the voice. He refused to be consumed. He refused to be dominated. Rhaast mocked his resolve, calling him a child playing with ancient power, but Kayn did not yield. As he carried the scythe into battle, a legend grew. Whispers spread among enemies and allies alike about the boy with the Darkin weapon. In the shadows of Ionia, farmers told their children that a figure moved through the night like smoke, striking down those who would harm them. Noxian soldiers spoke in hushed tones about a reaper whose blade hungered for those who dared set foot on Ionian soil. The name Shadow Reaper was murmured with fear and awe. Kayn did not mind the name. He liked the sound of it. It felt like acknowledgement. Yet the legend was a double-edged sword. With each retelling, the line between Kayn and Rhaast blurred in the eyes of others. Some believed he was already lost, that the Darkin spoke through him. Others believed he could become something more, a bridge between human and Darkin. Kayn himself wrestled with what he wanted to be. He saw two paths before him. On one path, he fully embraced the scythe, letting Rhaast's power merge with his own. On the other, He mastered the Scythe without losing his humanity, becoming a shadow that even the Darkin could not corrupt. The choice was his, and each day he felt the pull of both. One evening, while meditating in the courtyard, Kayn saw Zed approach. Shadows lengthened with the setting sun, and the temple stones glowed with a warm hue. Zed sat next to him without a word. For a while they watched the horizon. Then Zed spoke of the future of the Order. He reminded Kayn of the sacrifices that had brought them to this point. He acknowledged that the Order's methods were harsh, but he insisted they were necessary. He asked Kayn what he wanted. Kayn took a deep breath. He said he wanted to ensure that no one would be used as he had been used. He wanted to make decisions rather than be a tool. He wanted to prove that those who embraced power could still have purpose beyond domination. Zed listened, nodded, and warned him that ambition without discipline could lead to ruin. Kayn understood. They sat in silence again, the weight of unspoken possibilities hanging heavy. In the months that followed, Kayn's missions took him beyond Ionia. Zed sent him to the deserts of Shurima to observe movements of treasure hunters and to learn about other ancient powers. There, among dunes and ruins, Kayn encountered relics of a long-forgotten empire. The sun beat down mercilessly, and sand seemed to stretch endlessly. He traveled with a small group, avoiding bandits and ruthless archaeologists. In the ruins, he saw murals depicting warriors wielding weapons akin to Rhaast. He felt Rhaast stir with recognition. The Darkin whispered names and fragments of the past. He told Kayn about wars that predated recorded history. Kayn listened, gleaning not just power, but caution. If such weapons could topple empires, he would need to understand them. From Shurima, he traveled to Demacia, a land of orderly fields and strict laws. He moved under the cover of night, observing how those with magical abilities were hidden or hunted. He saw how the kingdom's fear of magic led to oppression. He felt a strange kinship with those hiding their true selves. When a mage was about to be captured, he intervened from the shadows, leaving no trace. Demacian soldiers spoke of a ghost, but they could not confirm his existence. Kayn left as quietly as he came, taking with him an appreciation for the subtle forms of tyranny. In the frozen north of Freljord, he faced different challenges. Snowstorms reduced visibility to mere feet. Ice cracked underfoot with deceptive gentleness. Kayn met shamans who spoke of spirits and the cycle of seasons. Around campfires, he listened to stories of ancient beings buried beneath ice. Rhaast scoffed at them, but Kayn found comfort in the quiet and the crackle of burning wood. He watched northern warriors fight not for conquest, but for survival against the elements. He learned to move in heavy furs, to use shadow against whiteness, to time his strikes to the rhythm of the wind. In Piltover, the city of progress, he saw a different kind of power. Streets were lined with elegant buildings and bridges connected islands of innovation. Sparks flew from workshops where inventors worked on Hextech devices. Kayn walked unseen through the crowds, listening to merchants haggle and scholars debate. He met a man who sold information about artifacts, and, for a price, he acquired knowledge of other Darkin relics rumored to exist. Piltover's sister city, Zaun, lay below in perpetual haze. There, he saw people struggling beneath pollution and gangs. He moved through alleys where toxins hung in the air like spirits, helping those he could without being seen. He left with the taste of metal and chemicals on his tongue, and with a deeper understanding of how progress and suffering could be intertwined. On a voyage to Bilgewater, a port city of pirates and traders, Kayn sailed across choppy seas. The smell of salt and fish filled the air. He watched as sea monsters were hauled onto docks, as captains argued over spoils, and as fortune-tellers whispered warnings of long-buried treasures. He felt the pull of deep waters and ancient creatures. Some whispered that a Darkin weapon had been lost in the depths. Rhaast laughed at the idea of being beneath waves. Kayn entertained the thought of diving into the ocean to search, but he knew his journey had other purposes. He was there to learn, to observe, and to understand the breadth of Runeterra. Throughout his travels, Kayn sent messages back to Zed. He reported not just on military movements, but on the philosophies of those he encountered. He gathered stories of spirits, of technology, of war, and of peace. He learned that every region had its own way of dealing with power and fear. Some embraced rigid order, others chaos. Some sought balance, others domination. In each place, he saw reflections of his own struggle with Rhaast. He saw that the temptation to control or destroy was universal. He also saw that people resisted in ways both subtle and overt. He admired those who fought for autonomy. He despised those who oppressed, and he measured himself against them all. Upon returning to Ionia, he brought with him a wealth of experience. He resumed his training with renewed perspective. He taught younger acolytes to observe the world before judging it, to see patterns, to question motives. He taught them how to move through shadows, how to blend physical skill with mental discipline. He spoke about the weight of power and the importance of intention. Some listened intently, eager to learn. Others bristled, believing that raw strength mattered more. Kayn recognized his younger self in them. He smiled grimly and let them make their own mistakes, guiding them gently when needed. The internal dialogue with Rhaast continued. Sometimes the Darkin's voice was softer, almost coaxing. Sometimes it was harsh, calling him weak for resisting. When Kayn was tired or injured, Rhaast would press harder, offering relief in exchange for surrender. Kayn learned to rest without letting go. He would recall the feeling of cold water on his face, the scent of forest air, the memory of Zed's eyes when he was first recruited. These anchors reminded him of who he was and who he intended to be. He also learned to allow Rhaast to share his knowledge without giving in. He would listen to ancient stories, gleaning tactics and strategies, then politely decline any suggestion that he let Rhaast take control. One day, while exploring a ruin deep in a mountain valley, Kayn came across carvings that depicted a being dividing itself into two. Half was light, half shadow. The figure held a scythe in one hand and a blade in the other. The image struck him. It mirrored his own struggle. He sat before it and meditated. Rhaast scoffed, but the scene resonated. He realized that his journey was not simply about choosing one path. It was about navigating between extremes. Zed had taught him that balance was not enough, but he also knew that unchecked ambition could destroy. The carving suggested that duality was part of existence. He took comfort in that realization. He decided that he would not let either side define him completely. He would define himself by constant adaptation. Seasons changed, and with them the tides of war. Noxus regained strength, and rumors suggested they planned another incursion. The Order of Shadow prepared, Acolytes sharpened blades, practiced techniques, and scouted the border. In one pivotal battle near a mountain pass, Kayn led a group of acolytes. He moved through shadows like a wraith, directing strikes that cut through the enemy ranks. The scythe cleaved armor. Shadows wrapped around foes and pulled them into darkness. Rhaast exulted. Kayn remained steady. He felt the surge of battle, but he did not lose himself. After the fight, he gathered his group, tended to their wounds, and shared lessons from the encounter. As time wore on, the Order grew in prominence. People whispered about their successes, their secrets, and their future. Some called for their disbandment, fearing the consequences of shadow power. Others praised them for protecting Ionia. Zed remained focused on his mission. He avoided politics, though politics came to him. When elders sought to negotiate, he sent emissaries, often choosing Kayn. Kayn learned to speak not just through blades, but through words. He listened, responded with measured tone, and left impressions. He learned that influence was not only won through fear, but also through understanding and clarity. Kayn's relationship with Zed evolved. They still trained together, though not as often. They spoke of strategy, of philosophy, and of the shape of the future. Zed saw that Kayn's vision extended beyond Ionia. Kayn saw that Zed's focus remained on protecting their homeland at any cost. They debated, sometimes heatedly, about how far to extend their reach. Kayn argued that knowledge and control of Darkin power could allow them to preempt threats before they arose. Zed cautioned that spreading too far would dilute their strength and invite enemies on multiple fronts. Their disagreements did not erode their respect, but they did highlight differences. One quiet night, Kayn stood on a cliff overlooking a valley. Fireflies danced above a stream, their light reflecting on the water. The moon hung low, casting a pale glow. He felt the weight of his scythe on his shoulder. He closed his eyes and listened. The rustle of leaves, the distant cry of an owl, the whisper of Rhaast. The Darkin asked him what he truly wanted. Kayn considered his answer. He did not want to conquer for conquest's sake. He did not want to destroy without purpose. He wanted the freedom to decide his own fate and to ensure that no one would use him as a tool. He wanted to lead, not to dominate, but to guide those who would follow. He wanted to prove that embracing power did not require losing oneself. He whispered these intentions into the night. Rhaast listened. The Darkin said nothing for a long moment. Then he laughed softly and said, "They would see." With time, Kayn became known not only as the Shadow Reaper, but as a teacher, a strategist, and a traveler. He walked through villages where children once hid from soldiers and found them laughing and running again. He walked past rivers where he had drunk while fleeing and found bridges rebuilt. He saw monuments erected to those lost and to those who fought. He felt the weight of his own name in whispers and glances. He carried that weight with a mixture of pride and humility. The future remained uncertain. Darkin weapons still existed, hidden in forgotten places. Powers shifted across continents, alliances formed and dissolved, magic evolved, machines advanced. Through it all, Kayn continued to train, to meditate, and to explore. He maintained his internal dialogue, never letting Rhaast gain the upper hand. He pressed forward, not as a pawn of the empire he had once fled, nor as a mindless vessel of ancient power, but as a person who had chosen his path. He knew that the struggle would not end, but he also knew that he was no longer the boy who had thrust a spear in fear. He was a man shaped by shadow and steel, by mentors and enemies, by journeys and meditations. He was the master of his fate, even as he remained a student of the darkness. After the intense months of confinement and supervised training, the shape of Kayn's days settled into a rhythm that was both reassuring and unsettling. Each morning before dawn, he would rise from his mat and step into the courtyard where dew still clung to the grass. The world in that hour was hushed, save for the soft chirping of early birds and the distant rumble of water. He would stretch his limbs, feeling the slight ache in muscles that never quite relaxed. Then he would begin his drills. With the scythe in his hands, he would carve slow arcs through the air, testing balance and control. Each movement was deliberate, designed to reinforce discipline. Each breath was measured in and out, like the tide. Sometimes he trained alone, shadows his only companions. Other times, a circle of acolytes would gather to watch and learn. His movements fascinated them. The way he blended weapon techniques with shadow manipulation looked effortless, but it had been forged through countless hours of practice and pain. Kayn would pause occasionally to correct a stance, to demonstrate a technique, or to share a lesson. He spoke sparingly, choosing his words with care. The young acolyte's eyes widened at his stories of how a misstep in shadow work could lead to a fall, how allowing fear to creep in could give the Darkin a foothold, how discipline was the only barrier between mastery and madness. As the sun climbed higher, casting long beams of light across stone, he would retreat to cool interior spaces for meditation. He would sit cross-legged with the scythe resting before him, its blade gleaming with a subtle inner glow. He would close his eyes and slow his breathing, letting his mind drift like mist over water. In those moments, the boundary between his thoughts and Rhaast's presence blurred. The Darkin would make comments, sometimes mocking, sometimes informative. Kayn learned that if he engaged with the voice directly, it gained strength. Instead, he acknowledged its presence, let it pass like a cloud, and maintained focus on his anchor points. He would visualize the river he had seen near Baal, the moonlight on its surface, the feeling of letting a secret slip through a crack in the wall. These memories grounded him. Occasionally, Rhaast grew impatient with silence and would share memories of his own memories of ancient times when his kind ruled the battlefield. Kayn saw glimpses of towering warriors with skin like polished stone and eyes that burned with unnatural light. He saw cities built around colossal statues, deserts that stretched beyond sight, and skies scarred by unnatural storms. He witnessed the arrogance of the Darkin, their belief that they were above mortality, and he saw their fall. The images were fragments, often distorted by the Darkin's pride, but they offered insight into the weapon's nature. Kayn understood that Rhaast's hunger was not just for blood, but for relevance. The Darkin did not want to fade into history. He wanted to shape it again. Kayn's days were not consumed solely by training and meditation. Zed insisted that his disciples understand the broader world they sought to influence. Thus, Kayn spent hours in the Order's archives, scrolling through old manuscripts, reading accounts of battles, treaties, and alliances. He learned the names of generals, the rise and fall of empires, the reasons certain decisions had been made. He read about the cataclysmic rune wars, about the ascension of mortals into godlike beings, about the tragedies that befell those who grasped at power without foresight. In the margins of these texts, previous readers had scribbled notes. Some commented on strategy, others on the moral implications of actions. Kayn found a note beside an account of a monarch who had sacrificed 100 people to prevent a larger calamity. The note simply read, "Is this the difference between hero and villain?" Kayn pondered that question for days. He also spent time with healers and artisans within the Order. Though the Order of Shadow was known for its martial prowess, it sustained itself with more than blades and shadows. There were those who tended wounds, those who carved masks, those who cooked meals, and those who repaired armor. Kayn learned to respect their contributions. One healer, an older woman named Haya, taught him about herbs that calmed the mind and herbs that sharpened focus. She showed him how to wrap a wound properly, how to recognize infection, and how to prepare a poultice. Every warrior, she said, must know how to heal, for the battlefield does not wait for others. Kayn listened with interest, realizing that self-reliance extended beyond fighting. On certain evenings, when the sky was clear and stars shimmered like scattered gems, the acolytes would gather around small fires. Someone would bring out a musical instrument and simple songs would drift on the night air. Storytellers would recount legends of Ionian spirits, of heroic deeds, of tragedies and triumphs. These gatherings reminded Kayn that despite their training in darkness, they were still human. He would sit slightly apart, listening. He rarely joined in the songs, but he found comfort in the shared warmth and soft laughter. He also noticed that Rhaast fell silent during these moments. Perhaps even the Darkin felt the power of communal stories. Zed, for his part, continued to mentor Kayn, though their interactions shifted from direct instruction to conversation. They would walk along pathways that wound around cliffs and waterfalls. Zed would ask questions that were less about technique and more about perspective. When you see a group of strangers arguing, he asked one day, "How do you choose whether to intervene?" Kayn considered and replied that he gauged the situation, looked for threats, looked for injustice. Zed nodded, then posed another question. What if intervention saves a life but reveals our presence? These discussions forced Kayn to think beyond immediate action. He realized that every choice had layers, and that leadership required weighing consequences not just for himself, but for many. During one such walk, Zed shared a piece of his own history. He spoke of growing up in an order that valued harmony and denial of negative emotions. He spoke of encountering invaders who exploited that harmony. He spoke of killing his own master, a man he had respected, because he believed it was necessary to protect Ionia. His voice did not waver, but pain lingered beneath the words. Kayn listened, feeling a rare connection to the man who was both his savior and commander. He understood that Zed's choices had not been easy. He also understood that the path of the Order of Shadow was paved with decisions that would be judged by history in various ways. It strengthened his resolve to make choices he could live with. Time within the Order had its own flow. Seasons changed, marked by different blossoms, different winds, different sounds. In spring, cherry trees near the temple would explode in delicate pink blossoms that drifted like soft rain when breezes blew. Kayn would stand beneath them, watching petals fall like snow, the scent sweet and calming. In summer, the air grew thick and humid. Cicadas hummed relentlessly. The nights were warm and crickets sang. Kayn trained longer, sweating through clothes, muscles burning, lungs drawing in heavy air. In autumn, leaves turned gold, red and brown, swirling down to carpet the ground. The world felt reflective, introspective. Kayn found himself thinking about how leaves let go when their time came. In winter, frost touched the edges of stones, and breath hung in visible puffs. Waterfalls slowed, and evenings came sooner. Training with a scythe in the cold was different. Metal grew brittle, fingers stiffened more quickly. Kayn adapted, learning to respect the seasons as teachers. There were moments of levity amidst the seriousness. On one occasion, Benzer attempted to cook a dish he had enjoyed as a child. He gathered ingredients from the forest and concocted a stew that smelled promising. Several acolytes, including Kayn, sat around the pot awaiting the meal. When they tasted it, their faces contorted. Benzer had confused two herbs, turning the stew unbearably bitter. Laughter erupted, loud and genuine. Even Zed, passing by, paused and smirked. They ended up roasting root vegetables over a fire instead, sharing jokes and stories about failed recipes. Kayn held on to that memory as proof that camaraderie could exist in a place often associated with darkness. As the Order continued to intervene in conflicts across Ionia, Kayn led more missions. One such mission took him to a region where an Ionian village was under threat from bandits taking advantage of the war's chaos. The bandits were not Noxian, but locals who saw an opportunity. The villagers were desperate and appealed to the Order for help. Kayn and a small team arrived under cover of night. Rather than engage in direct combat, he observed first. He watched how the bandits operated when they were vulnerable and whether any among them might be swayed. He discovered that they bullied a nearby settlement to supply them with food. He also discovered that one bandit, a young man barely older than Kayn had been when conscripted, seemed conflicted. Kayn approached him alone, emerging from shadows like a ghost. He spoke quietly, offering the bandit a chance to leave without bloodshed. The young man hesitated, looking back toward his companions, then dropped his weapon and fled. When the confrontation came, the remaining bandits were disorganized. Kayn and his team neutralized them without killing, tying them up and delivering them to local authorities. The villagers were grateful, offering food and blessings. Kayn accepted with a nod, feeling the weight of non-lethal choices. Another mission involved retrieving an artifact stolen from an Ionian monastery. The artifact was not particularly powerful, but it held sentimental and historical value. It had been taken by a collector who sold items to the highest bidder. Kayn infiltrated the collector's estate, moving past guards who boasted about their employer's wealth. He saw expensive art lining the walls and shelves filled with items plundered from various cultures. He felt a flare of anger. The collector, a plump man with rings on every finger, sat drinking in a hall. Kayn stepped out from a shadow and placed the tip of his scythe near the man's throat. In a calm voice, he asked for the artifact. The collector trembled and pointed to a chest. Kayn retrieved it and left without further bloodshed. The monastery's elders thanked him, tears in their eyes. They told him stories of the artifact's origin, how it had been carved by a monk who lost his family but found peace in creating something that others could look upon for solace. Kayn touched the carving and felt its smooth lines, its intentional imperfections. He considered how objects can carry memories and how theft of such objects was an offense beyond physical loss. As his reputation grew, Kayn began receiving letters and messages from people outside the Order. Some sought his aid, others warned him to stay away. A group of Ionian artists invited him to a performance in a secluded glade, promising a dance that told a story of night and day in perfect balance. Kayn attended, standing at the edge of the gathering, watching dancers move with grace that rivaled any martial technique. The performance depicted a struggle between shadow and light, not as enemies, but as partners whose dance created the world. The audience was silent, moved by the beauty and symbolism. Kayn felt tears prick his eyes, unexpected and uncontrolled. When he returned to the Order, he found that the experience had softened something inside him. He realized that art could teach as much as battles. Not all interactions were positive. There were those in Ionia who despised the Order, believing it brought only more violence. On a narrow mountain path, an elder confronted Kayn, accusing the Order of escalating conflicts and poisoning minds with darkness. The elder's eyes were bright with conviction. Kayn listened, feeling the sting of the words. He responded not with anger, but with an acknowledgement that their methods were harsh, yet, in his view, necessary to counter threats. The elder remained unconvinced and turned away. Kayn stood there as the wind swept around him, carrying the scent of pine. He knew he could not change everyone's mind, but he also knew that ignoring criticism entirely could make him blind. He reflected on the need for humility and the danger of believing too firmly in one's path. The more Kayn travelled, the more he realized that his own identity was a tapestry woven from contradictory threads. He was Noxian by birth, Ionian by adoption. He was both student and teacher. He wielded a weapon crafted by an ancient being that despised mortality, yet he chose to fight for mortal lives. He followed Zed's philosophy, yet he questioned it. He wanted freedom from control, yet he carried a weapon that constantly sought to control him. Each thread pulled in a different direction. Sometimes he felt as if he might unravel. But then he would remember the carving of the figure split into light and shadow. He would remember that duality existed not to tear apart, but to balance, to create tension that could lead to movement and growth. Rhaast, for his part, never ceased trying to influence him. There were times when the Darkin's voice was alluring, promising immediate solutions to complex problems. When a mission seemed impossible, Rhaast would whisper, "Let me take over, and we will cut through this in a heartbeat." When Kayn was frustrated by bureaucracy or delay, Rhaast would taunt, "They are weak. They waste time. We could be done." Kayn learned to respond with questions. He would ask Rhaast about his own past, about the consequences of the Darkin's choices. Rhaast, caught off guard, would either deflect or offer bitter reflections. Through these exchanges, Kayn gleaned insights into the nature of corruption. He realized that corruption often masked itself as efficiency, as directness, as clarity. It was subtle. It appealed to impatience. Understanding this allowed him to resist better. There were nights when Kayn's dreams were filled with visions not wholly his own. He would see himself standing in an endless desert, sun beating down, Rhaast's blade buried in sand before him. Shadows stretched from his body, forming shapes that resembled other Darkin. He heard the cries of creatures that no longer existed. He saw a vast battlefield littered with weapons too large for human hands. In these dreams, he felt both powerful and alien. He would wake with sweat on his brow, heart racing. He would lie there, listening to the quiet night and remind himself of the present. The dream's residue would linger, but he would focus on his breathing, on the tangible world around him. He would recall a child laughing in a village, the smell of a stew being stirred, the sight of cherry blossoms falling. These memories pulled him back from the brink. During one significant journey, Zed sent Kayn to a region near the peaks of Mount Targon. The mountain was known as a place where mortals could ascend to become aspects of celestial power. It was a place of great risk and immense reward. Kayn was not asked to climb the mountain that was not his destiny, but to observe and gather information about a group that had been disrupting supply lines. The path up the lower slopes was treacherous. Altitude made breathing difficult. Weather changed rapidly, fog rolling in thick and blinding. Kayn moved slowly, testing footholds, using shadows to bridge gaps. He encountered pilgrims who walked with determination, seeking answers among the stars. Their faces were serene, their eyes shining with internal fire. He spoke to one, an older man whose beard was frosted with ice. The man told him of visions he hoped to receive, of understanding he wished to gain. Kayn listened respectfully. He wondered what answers the man sought and what price he would pay. The group disrupting supply lines turned out to be a small band of warriors who believed that the mountain's gifts should not be shared with those they deemed unworthy. They attacked caravans taking provisions intended for villages that could not feed themselves. Kayn confronted them, gliding through fog like a phantom. He knocked weapons from hands, tripped feet, and locked eyes with their leader. The leader spoke of purity, of keeping gifts exclusive. Kayn argued that the mountain's blessings were not theirs to control. They fought in the thin air, each movement deliberate to conserve oxygen. Kayn disabled them without killing. He tied them up and left them with a stern warning. The pilgrims watched silently. Some thanked him, others turned away, perhaps agreeing with the bandit's sentiments. Kayn descended, lungs burning, thoughts swirling about the layers of belief and power. On his way back from Targon, Kayn took a detour through a region known for its vast fields of golden wheat. Harvest season was in full swing. Farmers sang as they cut stalks, their voices carrying over the wind. The scene was reminiscent of peace, yet Kayn knew that war's shadow always lingered. He walked among them, unseen, listening to their songs. One line caught his attention: "The blade that cuts for harvest feeds the village." He considered the parallels to his own blade. The scythe was a tool of death, yet he wished to wield it in a way that ultimately fed life, that protected rather than destroyed wantonly. He carried that thought with him as he returned to the Order. The Order's stronghold occasionally hosted visitors from allied groups. One such visitor was a young man from a faraway land where people built homes high among the trees. He had come to learn shadow techniques to protect his own homeland from encroaching threats. He was earnest and eager, his eyes wide with wonder as he observed the Order. Kayn was assigned to train him. At first, the young man stumbled, unused to moving silently. His footfalls were heavy, his breathing loud. Kayn corrected him gently, demonstrating how to shift weight, how to pause and listen to the rhythm of the environment. Over time, the young man improved. He began to glide rather than stomp, to breathe quietly. He thanked Kayn repeatedly, gratitude shining. "I will take what I learn here," he said, "and use it to shield my family." Kayn felt a warmth at his words. He realized that the Order's influence extended far beyond Ionia's borders, that the knowledge passed on had ripples. As his reputation spread, Kayn encountered others who wielded magic, technology, or physical prowess. In a dense jungle, he crossed paths with a man from Ixtal, a region known for its mastery of elemental magic. The man moved with grace, calling forth vines and plants with a flick of his wrist. Kayn watched, fascinated by the symbiosis between human and nature. They did not fight. Instead, they exchanged brief nods and continued on their ways, each respectful of the other's journey. In a bustling city, he observed a woman who combined mechanical arms with precise shooting, her gaze sharp as she scanned for threats. He wondered what drove her, what burdens she carried. He felt connected to them in a distant way, all of them navigating a world of conflict and power. Back at the stronghold, Kayn took on more responsibility in training new recruits. He designed exercises that tested not only physical agility, but also decision-making. In one, recruits were presented with two paths, one that led to immediate confrontation, one that required patience. Many chose the immediate path, eager to prove themselves. Kayn observed their impatience and reminded them afterward that sometimes waiting yields better results. In another exercise, he blindfolded them and asked them to move through a maze using only their hearing. He noticed how fear of the unseen made some hesitate, while others rushed and stumbled. He taught them to trust their senses, to slow down, to listen. He often ended these sessions with a meditation, encouraging them to find stillness in their minds, even as their bodies thrummed with energy. He told them that shadows respond to calm minds more readily than to chaotic ones. The practice of meditation became a cornerstone of Kayn's daily routine. He began exploring different forms, walking meditation, in which he focused on the feel of ground beneath his feet; breath meditation, where he counted inhales and exhales; and even sound meditation, where he listened to a single note from a flute and let it guide his thoughts. Each form revealed new facets of his mind. He discovered that some thoughts were like stubborn roots, hard to pull out. Others were like leaves, drifting away if he did not chase them. He learned to watch his mind with curiosity rather than judgment. Rhaast, impatient with stillness, would sometimes hiss in frustration, but Kayn kept his focus. He found that the stronger his meditation practice, the easier it was to resist the Darkin's suggestions. There were times, however, when control slipped. In a particularly difficult mission, Kayn's team was ambushed. Arrows rained down from cliffs, and acolytes cried out as they took cover. Kayn felt a flash of anger. Rhaast sensed it and surged forward, promising to end the threat quickly. For a split second, Kayn allowed the Darkin more influence, and the Scythe cut through the air with ferocity. Enemies fell, and the ambush was thwarted, but Kayn felt a cold satisfaction that was not entirely his. He pulled back, heart racing. Later, in the quiet of his chamber, he confronted Rhaast. "That was your hand," he said. Rhaast laughed. "And you liked it." Kayn did not respond. He meditated for hours, reflecting on how easily he had been tempted. He vowed to tighten his vigilance. Not long after, Zed asked him to journey to a remote coastal cliff where rumor held that a fragment of a Darkin weapon lay buried. Such rumors were common, and most were false, but they could not be ignored. Kayn traveled with a small team, braving rocky paths and treacherous waves. The air smelled of salt, and gulls cried overhead. At the cliff's edge, they found a cave, its entrance obscured by vines. Inside, the air was damp and cool. They navigated narrow passages, feeling walls slick with moisture. At the deepest point, they discovered a shard of metal embedded in stone. It resonated with a faint power. Kayn touched it. Rhaast hummed, recognizing the remnant of a kin. The shard was inert, incapable of awakening without a host. Nevertheless, they pried it from the rock and sealed it in a lead container. Kayn wondered how many such fragments lay scattered across the world, remnants of a war that few remembered. He also wondered what would happen if someone less disciplined found them. As the years passed, Kayn matured in ways he had not anticipated. Lines appeared at the corners of his eyes, not from age, but from time spent squinting into the distance, from nights spent awake contemplating choices. His hair grew longer, tied back often to keep out of his way. Scars marked his arms and shoulders, each one a story of a fight survived, a lesson learned. He wore them without shame. He grew taller, his movements more controlled, more economical. He spoke with greater authority, though he still preferred to listen first. He found himself thinking of the younger Kayn, the boy conscripted into an army, the youth who stabbed a man in fear, the fugitive who stumbled through a forest and felt both compassion and distance. That boy was gone, yet his memories remained as seeds that had grown into the man Kayn became. One evening, as rain drummed softly on the roof, Kayn sat with Haya, the healer. She was older now, hair streaked with silver. She wrapped a bandage around his arm where a training wound had reopened. "Your scars tell stories," she said, "but scars are not the only things that hold memories. Your eyes do too." She looked into his eyes, and Kayn felt seen in a way that had little to do with power. "You carry heavy burdens," she continued. "Do not forget to lay them down sometimes." Kayn nodded, thanking her. Her words lingered long after the bandage was tied. He realized that carrying burdens without pause could lead to bitterness. He resolved to seek more moments of lightness. Seeking lightness led him to unexpected places. One day, he agreed to accompany a group of acolytes on a journey not for battle, but for celebration. They traveled to a village celebrating the harvest. Lanterns hung from trees, illuminating paths with soft orange glow. Tables groaned under the weight of food, steamed buns, roasted vegetables, sticky rice wrapped in leaves. Children ran with ribbons, weaving between adults. Musicians played drums and flutes. Kayn stood at the edge, watching at first. Then a young girl tugged at his sleeve, offering him a rice cake. He accepted, taking a bite. Sweetness filled his mouth. A woman invited him to dance. He hesitated, then joined. His movements awkward at first, then smoother as he surrendered to the rhythm. He laughed. It was a sound he barely recognized as his own. Rhaast made a snide comment about the frivolity, but Kayn ignored him. The night was filled with warmth, and, for a while, he let his worries drift away. In another season, he travelled to a lakeside to meet with a hermit known for his wisdom about spirits. The hermit lived in a hut built on stilts, surrounded by reeds and lotus flowers. He spent his days fishing and speaking to those who sought him out. Kayn sat with him on a wooden platform that creaked gently with the water's movement. The hermit served tea infused with jasmine. They drank in silence. Eventually, Kayn asked how to reconcile being both student and teacher. The hermit smiled and said, "A student asks questions. A teacher listens. To reconcile them, ask your own questions and listen to your own answers. Kayn pondered that. Before he left, the hermit gave him a carved wooden talisman shaped like a wave. It reminds you that water flows around obstacles, he said. Perhaps your path does too. Kayn tucked the talisman into his pouch. In the nights that followed, he often turned it over in his hands, feeling the smooth curves carved by someone else's fingers. There were darker periods as well. Rumors of Darkin activity stirred. Whispers spoke of a sword that had chosen a host somewhere in the west. Stories circulated of entire villages wiped out, of survivors with glazed eyes, speaking of a shadow with crimson eyes. The Order sent scouts to verify these claims. Some returned with reports of massacres. Others did not return at all. Kayn felt a mix of dread and curiosity. He knew he was not the only one wielding a Darkin weapon, but he had not yet encountered another. When he expressed a desire to hunt this other Darkin, Zed cautioned him. "Your duty is to Ionia," he said. "Do not chase phantoms." Kayn understood the warning, but part of him burned with the need to test himself against another Darkin. Rhaast, however, urged caution, perhaps out of self-preservation. During this time, Kayn spent more hours sparring with Zed. These matches were intense, silent except for the clash of metal and the whoosh of displaced air. Zed moved with fluid precision, his blades extensions of his will. Kayn relied on speed and unpredictability, using the scythe to create openings. Each bout lasted longer than the last. They tested each other, pushed each other. After one particularly grueling session, they sat side by side, catching their breath. Zed broke the silence by saying, "You are ready to lead more." He spoke of delegating more missions to Kayn, of trusting him with decisions that would affect not just squads, but entire operations. Kayn accepted, feeling both exhilaration and weight. Leadership meant responsibility for lives. It meant making choices that could lead to death or survival. He took the charge seriously. With this increased authority, Kayn oversaw the defense of a valley through which Noxians sought to march. The valley was narrow, flanked by high cliffs, perfect for an ambush. Kayn positioned acolytes along ledges hidden by foliage. He laid traps that would slow the enemy's advance. He instructed archers to aim for horses and supply wagons, to disrupt rather than annihilate. When the Noxians entered the valley, unaware of the danger, Kayn signaled. Arrows rained down, ropes were cut to release boulders, and shadows darted from rock to rock, sowing confusion. The Noxian commander attempted to rally his troops, but chaos spread. Some soldiers fled, others fought, but they lacked coordination. Kayn watched from above, ready to intervene if needed. He felt a tug from Rhaast to drop into the fray and harvest souls. He resisted, focusing on the larger picture. The ambush succeeded. The Noxian force retreated, and the valley remained under Ionian control. Kayn descended, checked on his acolytes, and ensured the wounded were tended to. He felt pride in the operation and gratitude for those who trusted his plan. In quieter moments, he wrote. He kept a journal, a practice suggested by the hermit. He would sit by candlelight and describe his day, his thoughts, his doubts. He wrote about Rhaast's words, about Zed's teachings, about scenes from his travels. He wrote about names he did not want to forget, Nakuri, Benza, Taro. He wrote about a man with gentle eyes who had fallen by his hand in his first battle. Putting words to his experiences allowed him to process them. He would reread entries months later and see patterns, growth, and mistakes. He noticed how his handwriting changed depending on his mood, tight and angular when anxious, loose when calm. The act of writing became another form of meditation. As his understanding deepened, he began to articulate a philosophy of his own. It was not a rejection of Zed's teachings, nor an acceptance of the Kinku's beliefs. It was a synthesis that reflected his life. He believed in decisiveness, but tempered by empathy. He believed in strength, but balanced by restraint. He saw shadow not as corruption, but as a tool that amplified what already existed within. He believed that power without purpose was hollow, and purpose without flexibility was rigid. He shared these thoughts with a small group of trusted acolytes. They debated, questioned, and added their own insights. These discussions were spirited, yet respectful. Through them, Kayn's ideas sharpened. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through bamboo leaves, Kayn sat with a young acolyte who had recently lost a friend in battle. The boy's eyes were red, his voice raw. He asked Kayn how to bear the weight of loss. Kayn thought of his own losses of Nakuri, of the child he once was. He told the boy that grief was a companion that arrived uninvited and left at its own pace. He spoke of honoring those lost by living fully, by carrying their memories forward. He warned against letting grief harden into bitterness. He shared that there were nights he still saw faces of those he had killed. He did not say these things to seek pity, but to show that pain was part of the journey. The boy listened, tears streaming down his cheeks. Afterward, they sat in silence, watching leaves flutter in the breeze. The possibility of an outright confrontation between Kayn and another Darkin weapon-bearer remained. As information trickled in about the sword, Kayn prepared. He reviewed what little was known about Darkin physiology and psychology. He practiced using the scythe in ways that countered a blade, a different dynamic from his usual battles. He sparred with swordsmen in the Order, asking them to emulate unpredictable styles. He also meditated on his intention. He reminded himself that, if the encounter happened, his goal was to prevent harm, not to indulge in a test of strength. Rhaast's excitement was palpable. He spoke of how the other Darkin would be powerful, perhaps even his equal. He urged Kayn to let him free fully so they could triumph. Kayn acknowledged the Darkin's enthusiasm, then set it aside. He would cross that bridge when he came to it. Winter returned, harsh and unforgiving. Snow piled high against temple walls. Winds cut like blades. Training outdoors became difficult. Kayn and the acolytes moved inside, practicing in halls lined with stone pillars. The cold seeped into bones. Rhaast complained, his voice a low grumble. Kayn wrapped his hands in cloth, warmed them over braziers, and continued. He found that training in winter taught persistence. Muscles did not respond as quickly. Breath frosted the air. Each movement required more effort. It also taught the importance of preparation, ensuring that paths were cleared, that warm soup was available, that morale was kept high. He saw older members of the Order tell stories by fireside, their words painting pictures that warmed hearts. He joined, adding his own tales, weaving lessons into narratives. The shadows danced on walls, mirroring the flicker of flames. With the thawing of ice came the return of flowers. Life re-emerged. Acolytes cleaned the temple grounds, scrubbing moss from stones. Kayn took part, kneeling with a brush, scrubbing alongside others. The act of cleaning felt humbling, a reminder that service extended beyond battle. He He also helped hire plant herbs in a garden patch, mint, basil, chamomile. The smell of crushed leaves lingered on his fingers. He recalled how herbs had been used to heal him and others. He considered how small acts like planting could have far-reaching effects. Rhaast, uninterested, dozed, leaving Kayn with the sound of trowels and Hire's quiet humming. In a rare moment of openness, Rhaast shared with Kayn a memory that felt raw. The Darkin spoke of a time before his entrapment, when he stood on a battlefield surrounded by foes. He had wielded his scythe with joy, reveling in the fear he inspired. At the end of the battle, when the ground was soaked and his body exhausted, he had looked across the plain and seen another Darkin staring at him with hatred. Their eyes locked, and in that moment, Rhaast felt something akin to regret. He wondered briefly what his life could have been without endless war. Then he dismissed the thought and continued fighting. As Rhaast recounted this, his voice wavered. Kayn listened, feeling a stir of compassion for a being trapped by his nature. He responded by saying that regret could be a seed for change. Rhaast scoffed, then grew silent. The exchange lingered in Kayn's mind. It reinforced his belief that even those seemingly beyond redemption could feel. To broaden his understanding, Kayn visited the Kinku Order's territory. He did so under a banner of temporary truce arranged by mediators. The Kinku, guardians of balance, had long been at odds with the Order of Shadow. They believed in maintaining equilibrium and resisting extremes. Kayn was greeted by a member named Shen, a calm and stoic individual who led the Kinku. Shen walked with Kayn through tranquil gardens, past streams with stepping stones, and through halls decorated with calligraphy. They spoke about duty and sacrifice. Shen emphasized harmony, not just externally, but within. He said that embracing extremes, whether light or dark, risked upsetting the balance that allowed societies to thrive. Kayn countered that sometimes decisive action prevented greater harm. Their conversation was respectful, yet neither conceded. As they sat at a tea pavilion, Shen said, "We are not enemies, Kayn, even if we disagree. We both want to protect Ionia, though our methods differ." Kayn left with respect for Shen's conviction and an understanding that there were many paths to the same goal. In return, Shen later visited the Order of Shadow's stronghold. He watched acolytes train in darkness, observed their techniques, and spoke with Zed. The two leaders discussed the past, acknowledging mistakes and grievances. Kayn observed from a distance, appreciating the effort to bridge divides. He realized that when leaders were willing to talk, possibilities opened. However, he also knew that such dialogues were fragile. They required trust and honesty. He pledged to himself to be part of building that trust. As he matured further, Kayn's perception of himself and Rhaast evolved. He no longer saw the Darkin solely as an enemy to be resisted. He saw him as a teacher in a twisted way. Rhaast taught him what not to become, but also offered insights into strength and strategy that he might not have learned otherwise. He began to see their relationship as symbiotic, albeit contentious. He recognized that his mastery of the scythe was enhanced by the Darkin's knowledge. In turn, Rhaast's existence was prolonged and given purpose by Kayn's actions. The key was to ensure that the purposes aligned enough to avoid disaster. One evening, while cleaning his scythe, Kayn noticed a subtle pattern engraved along the blade. He had seen it before, but now he looked closer. The pattern resembled waves intertwined with flames, water, and fire, opposing elements coexisting on a weapon of shadow. He wondered about the artist who had forged the blade. He wondered if the pattern was a message about duality. He traced it with his finger, feeling the grooves. Rhaast commented that he had never noticed the pattern until Kayn pointed it out. They shared a rare moment of curiosity together, silent but present. Years continued to pass. Kayn watched as novices joined and elders retired. He watched as the world shifted, new alliances formed, old grievances resurfaced, technologies advanced. He adapted, learning new methods, incorporating new information into his strategies. He never stopped training, never stopped questioning. He remained vigilant over the Scythe and the Darkin within. He occasionally felt the urge to step away from the order, to wander freely, to see what he could become on his own. Yet he always returned to the stronghold. It was home, in its way. It was the place where he had been forged, where he had forged others. In his later years within the Order, Kayn's role became more consultative. Younger leaders took on operational tasks, while he offered guidance. He would sit in council meetings, listening to plans, offering suggestions, asking questions that others might not think to ask. He became known for his ability to see many sides of a situation, his past as a conscript, a fugitive, a student, a teacher, a wielder of a forbidden weapon, all of it combined to create a perspective few possessed. When he spoke, people listened. When he was silent, they considered why. He found satisfaction in mentoring, in seeing those he had trained rise to meet challenges. Through all of this, his relationship with Zed remained complex yet foundational. They disagreed at times, sometimes strongly, but they never lost respect. They became less master and student and more colleagues. In quiet moments, they would share tea and reminisce about the early days. Zed would occasionally smile softly, lines around his eyes deepening. "I saw a boy in the forest," he would say. "Now I see a man who has surpassed me in ways I did not predict." Kayn would respond with gratitude and a reminder that he was still learning. The day eventually came when rumors of the sword reached a crescendo. Confirmed sightings placed its bearer near the outskirts of Noxus. This time, Zed did not forbid Kayn from pursuing. He called him into his chamber and spoke plainly. "It is your choice. If you go as a representative of the Order, not to feed your own desires." Kayn understood. He prepared carefully, consulting with those who knew the terrain. He set out with a small team, Rhaast humming with anticipation. The journey took them through forests once again, across rivers and along the edges of Noxian encampments. Along the way, memories of his youth surfaced. He saw boys drilling in fields, heard the bark of commanders, smelled the smoke of cooking fires. He remembered his conscription, his fear, his rebellion. When he finally encountered the sword's bearer, it was not in a dramatic battlefield, but in the ruins of an old fortress. The bearer was a young woman with pale skin, eyes burning with an inner fire. She held the sword easily, as if it were part of her. Shadows and crimson light seemed to twist around her. She smiled when she saw Kayn, not with kindness, but with recognition. "So," she said, voice layered with another deeper tone, "Rhaast has found a pet." Kayn tightened his grip on the scythe. Rhaast responded with a low growl, ancient rivalry flickering. The ensuing confrontation was swift and intense. They circled each other, weapons singing through the air. Each tested the other's resolve, strength, and control. In those moments, Kayn felt the full weight of his training, his choices, his philosophy. He fought not to annihilate, but to neutralize. He aimed for disarmament, using shadows to bind rather than slice. The sword's-bearer fought with fury, perhaps driven by her Darkin's will. In the end, Kayn managed to knock the sword from her hand. He pinned it with the scythe and placed his foot on it, holding it down. He looked into her eyes and saw a flicker of humanity beneath the rage. He told her that surrendering the weapon was her only chance to live. She spat, defiant. Kayn did not kill her. Instead, he trapped the sword in a containment vessel and left her restrained to be judged by those she had harmed. The incident with the sword changed him. It solidified his understanding of the fine line he walked. He realized how easily power could consume even those who believed they controlled it. He returned to the Order, the containment vessel secure, and handed it over to Zed. They discussed what to do with it. Some argued for destruction, others for study. In the end, they decided to conceal it in a place known only to a few, guarding it not just with barriers, but with intention. Years rolled into decades. Kayn's hair streaked with silver. Rhaast's voice, though still sharp, seemed to mellow at times. The two had spent a lifetime together, each shaping the other. In a sense, they had grown old together. Kayn's body slowed, but his mind remained keen. He took longer walks, leaned on his scythe not as a weapon, but as a staff at times. Young acolytes still sought him out for advice. He would sit with them, tell stories of battles long past, and share lessons that were timeless. He would speak of choosing one's path, of balancing ambition with compassion, of listening to voices within and without. As Kayn entered the latter stages of his life, a new awareness took hold of him. It was not fear of death. He had faced death many times, both giving and receiving it. Rather, it was awareness of endings and beginnings, of the cycles that governed all things. Just as seasons turned and leaves fell and grew again, so too did roles and responsibilities change hands. He had spent decades wielding the scythe, training acolytes, advising leaders, wandering the world. He knew that his hand would not always be steady enough to swing the blade with lethal precision. He knew that new eyes and minds would need to interpret the shadows. He prepared for this transition with the same deliberation he brought to every mission. He began by spending more time with those who would one day guide the Order. He invited them into conversations not just about tactics, but about philosophy and intention. He asked them what kind of world they wanted to build, what they feared, what they believed. He listened to their responses, sensing their strengths and weaknesses. Some spoke passionately about expanding the Order's influence beyond Ionia, arguing that only by proactive engagement could they prevent future invasions. Others felt that the Order's purpose was best served within their borders, acting as guardians rather than conquerors. Kayn encouraged debate, reminding them that different perspectives strengthened strategy. He urged them to remember their humanity, to consider the cost of every decision, to respect the power they wielded and the lives they affected. At times, Kayn would take small groups on walks through the forests and hills surrounding the stronghold. He would point out plants that healed and plants that poisoned, teaching them that knowledge of natural resources was as vital as knowledge of weapons. He would ask them to move silently through dense undergrowth, listening to the sound of their own breathing, learning to feel the terrain beneath their feet. He would stop in a clearing and say, "Here, feel the difference between shade and sunlight on your skin. Shadows are not just something you command, they are part of the world. Respect them, and they will answer." He would speak of his first encounter with the Order, of how a boy fleeing death found a path among those who wielded shadows with purpose. The younger acolytes listened with reverence, some eyes widening at the thought that their seasoned mentor had once been as lost as they felt. Rhaast watched these interactions with his own commentary. "Passing on knowledge, are we?" he would murmur. "Such noble work." His tone was often mocking, but sometimes Kayn detected curiosity. The Darkin had seen countless cycles of war, power, and decline. He knew that mentoring was a way of extending oneself beyond a single lifespan. Kayn did not respond to the jabs. Instead, he allowed Rhaast to witness the impact he had on younger minds. Perhaps, he thought, this might plant a seed, however small, in the ancient spirit's understanding of mortality and legacy. In these later years, Kayn also revisited places that had shaped him. He travelled once more to the village near Baal, not as a fugitive or a rescuer, but as a visitor seeking closure. The village had been rebuilt. New houses stood where old ones had burned. New faces laughed where fear had once reigned. He walked slowly through the streets, unrecognized by most. An elder approached him and asked if he was lost. Kayn smiled and said he was simply remembering. He sat by the river where moonlight had once reflected on the water the night he had warned the villagers. He dipped his fingers into the current, feeling the cool rush against his skin. He whispered an apology to the man he had killed in fear, to Nakuri, to all those whose lives had intersected with his in violence. The water carried his words away. He felt lighter, as if a stone he had been carrying for years had been set down. He then ventured to the ruins where he had found Rhaast. The excavation site was now overgrown, nature reclaiming the scars left by shovels and pickaxes. Trees had pushed roots through former camps. Wildflowers sprouted in crevices. The pit where Rhaast had been buried was filled with water, reflecting the sky. Kayn stood at its edge, the scythe resting on his shoulder. He gazed into the calm pool and saw himself, older, hair touched with silver, eyes lined with experience. He also saw the faint outline of Rhaast within the reflection, a reminder that he had never stood alone since that day. He felt gratitude and sorrow mixed together. Gratitude for the strength the weapon had given him and for the lessons learned. Sorrow for the lives it had taken and the temptation it had represented. He took a deep breath, raised the scythe, and swung it slowly through the air, a ritual gesture of respect. He then turned and walked away, leaving the place at peace. On another journey, he returned to Freljord. Snow still blanketed the land, though the path was familiar. He sought the shaman he had met years ago, the one who had spoken of spirits and cycles. He found her in a new camp, older but still sharp-eyed. They sat by a fire and shared fermented fish, laughing at the taste. She told him of winters that had come and gone, of tribes uniting and dividing, of spirits angry and placated. She asked him about his own spirits, gesturing to the scythe. Kayn spoke openly, describing his long relationship with Rhaast. The shaman listened, then said, "We all carry spirits with us, some inherited, some chosen. The question is not whether they speak, but how we answer." Kayn nodded, feeling the truth of her words. He thanked her and left an offering of herbs by her tent. As he departed, he looked back at her figure silhouetted against the snow. The image stayed with him as a symbol of wisdom born from simplicity and endurance. He also visited Piltover once more, curious about how the city had evolved. He found it bustling with even more technological marvels. Devices whirred, vehicles floated, and lights burned bright even in daylight. He walked through markets where merchants sold enchanted crystals alongside mechanical parts. He watched a demonstration of a tiny mechanical bird that flapped its metal wings and sang. Children clapped, their faces glowing. He visited an inventor he had met in his younger days, now older, with goggles perched permanently on his head. The inventor showed him a device that measured magical energy, excitedly explaining how it might one day help protect people from dangerous spells. Kayn smiled, impressed by the ingenuity. He thought about how progress manifested differently in each region, through war in some, through innovation in others. He wondered how long it would take for these inventions to reach his homeland, and what they might change. In Zaun, he descended into industrial tunnels once more. The air was thick with fumes, but new filtration systems had been installed since his previous visit, reducing the choking haze. He saw a group of children playing a game with small gear wheels, their laughter echoing off metal walls. An older woman selling medicinal salve recognized him as a traveler from years past. She pressed a jar into his hand, insisting he take it for his journey. He thanked her, feeling a sense of continuity that spanned the chaos and decay. He thought about how even in places deemed grim and dangerous, kindness and resilience persisted. One of Kayn's last journeys took him to a remote island, a place spoken of in legends as where the veil between realms was thin. He travelled with only his scythe, a cloak, and provisions. The sea journey was rough, waves tossing the boat. He arrived on the island at dusk. The air was filled with the scent of salt and blooming night flowers. Strange lights flickered in the forest, guiding him to a clearing where ancient stones stood arranged in a circle. He sat in the center and closed his eyes. The sounds of waves and rustling leaves blended into a hum. He felt a presence around him, spirits or memories he could not tell. In that space, he invited Rhaast to speak openly. The Darkin appeared within his mind as a shadowed figure, less menacing than before, though still imposing. They conversed without pretense. Rhaast spoke of the boredom of immortality, of the anger of being bound, of the fear of fading. Kayn spoke of the weight of mortality, of the struggle to make meaning within a finite lifespan, of the desire to leave a legacy beyond destruction. They found, unexpectedly, a common ground in the fear of being forgotten. They sat in silence, sharing that vulnerability. When Kayn opened his eyes, the night was deep and stars burned bright. He smiled faintly, feeling a shift in the tension he had carried for decades. He felt a sense of peace between himself and the being he had fought daily. Back at the stronghold, Kayn began the process of choosing successors. He observed the acolytes, not just in training, but in how they treated one another, in how they spoke to healers and artisans, in how they reacted to unforeseen challenges. He looked for those who balanced resolve with empathy. He trusted his judgment, but he also sought counsel from Zed and other elders. Together, they named a council of leaders, rather than a single replacement. Kayn believed that shared responsibility reduced the risk of one person wielding power unchecked. He addressed the gathered order, his voice steady but softer than it had been in youth. He spoke of his journey, of mistakes and triumphs, of teachings passed down and lessons learned. He reminded them that the Order's purpose was to protect, not to dominate, and that power wielded without intention was dangerous. He asked them to continue to question, to adapt, to remember the faces of those they defended and those they confronted. He concluded by saying that his path was nearing its end, but theirs continued. The acolytes listened in solemn silence, some with tears in their eyes, others with determination burning. On his final night as an active leader, Kayn wandered through the stronghold, touching walls, running his fingers along carvings he had long ignored. He entered the armory and looked at the weapons lined neatly in racks. He remembered when each had been used, who had wielded them, what battles they had seen. He visited the training hall, now quiet, mats rolled up. He stepped into the kitchen, inhaling the lingering smell of spices. He walked through the gardens, brushing leaves lightly. He paused at the meditation room, empty but for a single candle flickering on an altar. He sat down, cross-legged, and closed his eyes. He breathed deeply. The shadows welcomed him like old friends. Rhaast spoke softly, not with command or mockery, but with curiosity. "Will you miss this?" he asked. Kayn smiled. "I will carry it with me." The next morning he rose before dawn, as he had countless times. He put on his cloak and strapped the scythe to his back. He walked to the entrance of the stronghold, where Zed waited. They faced each other in the dim light. Zed bowed slightly. Kayn returned the bow deeper. They embraced briefly, a rare gesture of affection. Zed said, "You have honored the shadows and the light within you." Kayn replied, "You gave me a chance when no one else would." They stood together, watching the horizon lighten. Then Kayn stepped forward, leaving the stronghold as the leader he had been, and returning as a wanderer. He traveled lightly, moving through forests and fields, crossing streams and climbing hills. He felt the weight of the scythe, now both weapon and companion. He visited a waterfall he had discovered years ago, where water plunged into a crystalline pool. He sat on a rock, shoes off, feet in the water. He watched dragonflies skim the surface, their wings iridescent. He listened to the rush of water, the call of birds, the whisper of wind through leaves. He closed his eyes and saw not just memories, but possibilities, a young acolyte sparring with an older one, a village celebrating a harvest, a child painting a mask, a leader deliberating a difficult decision, a Darkin spirit inside a weapon listening to a story told by a human. He opened his eyes and smiled. As he walked through a meadow dotted with wildflowers, he heard singing. It was a group of travelers, voices blending in harmony. They sang of heroes and shadows, of battles and peace, of sacrifices and hope. He recognized some of the verses as stories about the Order, embellished but recognizable. He also heard a verse about a man with a scythe who chose his own path between darkness and light. The words described him, though not by name. The melody carried on the breeze, lifting into the sky. Kayn paused, closing his eyes to listen. He felt emotion swell in his chest, gratitude, humility, joy. The story was no longer just his. It had become part of the tapestry of the world, woven into songs and whispers. He continued walking, the song fading behind him, the path stretching ahead. In his wanderings, he encountered a child attempting to catch a butterfly. The child's hands moved clumsily, the butterfly always just out of reach. Kayn watched, amused. Eventually he spoke, advising the child to move slower, to observe the butterfly's pattern. The child listened and, with patience, cupped the butterfly gently. The child looked up at Kayn, eyes alight with wonder. "Thank you," he said. Kayn nodded, then asked the child to release the creature, explaining that its freedom was precious. The child hesitated, then opened his hands, watching the butterfly lift into the air. Kayn walked on, feeling that small interaction as a confirmation of his belief that guidance could change outcomes without dominating them. As days turned to weeks, Kayn felt his energy wane. He had always been attuned to his body, knowing when to push and when to rest. Now, rest called more frequently. He would find a tree's shade, lean against its trunk, and let his eyes close. He would hear Rhaast's voice, softer, telling stories of ancient battles. Kayn would counter with tales of simple kindnesses. They would exchange, each appreciating the other's experiences. In one such moment, Rhaast confessed that he had not understood humans when he had first been bound. "You are fragile, yet stubborn," he said. "You feel so much. It is exhausting." Kayn laughed lightly. "And you," he replied, "you are powerful, yet bound. You see so much from so far. It is isolating." Rhaast was quiet for a time. "Perhaps," he admitted. The honesty between them felt like a culmination of their long journey. On an evening, when the sky blazed with hues of pink and gold, Kayn reached a hilltop with a view that spanned miles. He sat down, breathing in the scent of sun-warmed grass. He unslung the scythe and laid it across his lap. He ran his fingers along its blade, tracing the pattern of waves and flames. He whispered words of thanks to Zed, to Haya, to the hermit, to the shaman, to the acolytes, to the villagers, to the spirits, and, yes, even to Rhaast. He felt a presence settle beside him. He did not open his eyes, but he knew it was Rhaast, not as an adversary, but as a companion. Together they watched the sun sink slowly, painting clouds in vibrant colors. The air cooled, shadows lengthened. For a moment, everything was still. At last, Kayn's breath slowed. His hands rested on the scythe. The last light of day kissed his face. He felt no fear, only calm. He felt his life, long and full, held in balance. As the sun dipped below the horizon, he exhaled gently and did not inhale again. The scythe remained, its blade dark yet gleaming, its spirit humming softly. The wind picked up, carrying away the last warmth of day, rustling leaves, whispering through grass. It carried with it a story of a boy who became a shadow, of a man who became legend, of power tempered by purpose. It carried the lessons he had taught and the lives he had touched. And somewhere within that breeze, a darkened spirit listened and remembered. Back at the stronghold, a gust of wind moved through corridors, extinguishing candles. Acolytes looked up, sensing a change. Zed, sitting alone, closed his eyes and bowed his head. The shadows in the room flickered as if paying respect. Beyond the walls, in villages and cities, people went about their lives, unaware that a life had ended and a legacy had begun anew. In time, stories of Kayn grew and transformed. Some told of how he had defeated 100 enemies with a single swing. Others spoke of how he had conversed with spirits and been granted immortality. Artists painted him as both shadow and light, scythe in hand, hair flowing. Children pretended to be him, swinging sticks as if they were mighty blades. Scholars debated his philosophy, quoting his words and interpreting his actions. The Order of Shadow continued, guided by the council he had helped create. They faced new threats, forged new alliances, and remembered the lessons of their predecessors. They celebrated his life each year with a day of meditation followed by communal storytelling. They spoke not just of his victories, but of his struggles, his questions, his growth. Rhaast, bound to the Scythe, remained. The Darkin's voice spoke less often, as if contemplating everything he had experienced. He trained with new bearers, always testing, always whispering. But the memory of Kayn lingered within him like a gentle pressure. He could not forget the human who had shared his existence for decades, who had listened to him, argued with him, and finally understood him. Perhaps, in some way, Rhaast changed. Perhaps the next bearer would find the Darkin less corrosive, more reflective, though still dangerous. Perhaps that bearer would speak to Rhaast about Kayn, reminding the ancient spirit of the man who balanced ambition with purpose, who chose his path between light and shadow, and who embraced the complexity of his own duality. And so, the story did not end. It continued in whispers, in songs, in the swing of a blade, in the flicker of a shadow, in the choices made by those who followed. It continued in the waves on a blade, in the petals that fall in spring, in the laughter of a child at harvest. It continued wherever someone stood on the boundary between fear and courage and chose to step forward with intention and heart. In that choice, Kayn lived on. Long after Kayn's passing, the stronghold of the Order of Shadow continued to pulse with life. Footsteps echoed in halls, blades clashed in training, voices rose in debate. The council he had helped form led with a mixture of firmness and flexibility. The memory of Kayn hung in the air, not as a shadow but as a guiding star. His portrait painted in muted tones, eyes glimmering with both determination and compassion, hung in the central hall, where new recruits paused to look up at it, some bowing slightly in respect. Rhaast, bound to the Scythe, waited in a secure chamber, sealed by wards and watched by guardians. For a time, no one touched the weapon. The council believed that such power should not be wielded lightly. They studied the Scythe and weighed the consequences of letting it gather dust. But fate seldom respects caution forever. There came a day when threats pressed in from multiple fronts. The council convened, faces grave. They decided that the Scythe could not remain idle. It needed a bearer who could carry the weight with wisdom. Among the acolytes was a young woman named Liane. She had grown up hearing stories of the Shadow Reaper. Her parents had lived in a village saved by Kayn when she was an infant. They told her of a man with an unreadable gaze and a deadly blade who spared those who laid down arms. Liane joined the order out of a sense of gratitude and purpose. She trained diligently, absorbing techniques with focus. She was known for her calm under pressure and her ability to listen deeply. When the council deliberated on who would bear the Scythe, her name surfaced repeatedly. There were concerns. It was no small thing to ask someone to bond with a Darkin weapon. But after days of discussion, they approached her. Liane accepted, believing that she could honor Kayn's legacy. The day she took the Scythe from its resting place, the stronghold fell silent. Acolytes lined corridors, watching as she walked with measured steps. Zed, older but still vigilant, presided over the ritual. He told Liane that the path before her was treacherous, but not impossible. He spoke of Kayn and reminded her that she did not walk alone. Lian reached out and gripped the scythe. The metal was cold at first, then warmed, as if recognizing a living being. The moment her fingers tightened, she felt a presence ancient and curious. Rhaast stirred, sniffing at the newcomer. Inside Lian's mind, a voice said, "Another one. What makes you think you can control me?" It was Rhaast, testing. Lian inhaled and replied silently, "I do not seek to control you. I seek to work with you." The Darkin paused, surprised. Lian continued, "I have heard stories of Kayn. He found a way to harness your power without losing himself. I intend to do the same." Rhaast let out a sound that might have been a laugh. "We shall see," he whispered of power and glory. Lian listened, acknowledging his presence but keeping her own intention clear. The council watched as she lifted the scythe. Nothing erupted. A collective breath was released. Lian trained with the scythe under watchful eyes. She began with basic exercises, feeling the weight, understanding the balance. Rhaast offered advice unbidden, suggesting angles and maneuvers. Sometimes his suggestions were useful, derived from centuries of battle. Other times they carried a hunger for blood. Lian filtered his input. She practiced meditation, recalling Kayn's teachings passed down through the years. She grounded herself in memories of her village, her mother's laugh, her father's stories, the scent of rice cooking. She used these anchors to maintain her sense of self. When Rhaast tried to amplify her impatience, she responded with patience. When he tried to inflame her anger, she cooled it with understanding. In moments of solitude, Lian would sit with the scythe and speak to Kayn's memory. She would whisper, "If you can hear me, know that I honor you." She would recount her day, her fears, her hopes. Whether Kayn's spirit listened or not, she felt comforted. Rhaast listened too. At first he scoffed, but gradually the contempt softened. He began to offer small comments about Kayn, about how he had been stubborn, about how he had laughed at times. Lian found these glimpses precious. They reminded her that she was part of a lineage of bearers, each unique. Beyond the stronghold, in far-flung places, tales of Kayn took on lives of their own. In Bilgewater, sailors spoke of a ghost who walked the decks at night, scythe dragging, warning those who plotted mutiny. In Demacia, children whispered that if they strayed too far from home, the Shadow Reaper would snatch them up, only to be told by elders that he protected those who were innocent. In Shurima, merchants told of a man who could appear and vanish like a mirage, striking down thieves and then disappearing into sand. In Freljord, warriors recounted the story of the Darkin and the human who walked together, neither fully in control, each learning from the other. Some stories exaggerated, adding magic, others simplified, focusing on a single lesson. All kept his name alive. Rhaast, meanwhile, found himself comparing Lian to Kayn. He noted her discipline, her methodical approach, her tendency to ask questions. He tested her with visions of power, with scenarios designed to spark rage. She responded with patience. In frustration, he once blurted, "You are no Kayn." Lian smiled and replied, "I do not intend to be. I am Lian." The Darkin fell silent. He recalled conversations with Kayn. In subtle ways, his tone softened. He narrated fewer bloody fantasies and more practical insights. Lian chose to build her own relationship with Rhaast based on mutual recognition of strengths and boundaries. The Order's influence spread gradually, not through conquest, but through cooperation. They assisted the Kinku in quelling a rogue spirit. They worked with Piltover's enforcers to stop illegal trade in magical artifacts. They helped rebuild villages destroyed by bandit raids. They offered training to protectors from other regions, sharing knowledge of shadows in exchange for insights into light, elemental magic, or technology. They cultivated a reputation not just as assassins, but as guardians. They still struck when threats loomed, but they also negotiated and strategized. They remembered Kayn's words about the weight of power. They cited him in deliberations, sometimes disagreeing on what he would have done, but always considering his perspective. Zed continued to lead with a steady hand, though age showed in his slower steps. He sparred less, but his mind remained sharp. He mentored Leon personally, sharing stories of Kayn that had not been recorded. He told Leon that leadership was not about emulating predecessors, but about embodying principles in one's own way. He urged her to remain vigilant against arrogance. Leon listened. In the fullness of time, Runeterra faced challenges that Kayn had never known. New technologies threatened to disrupt old balances. Magic evolved. Nations rose and fell. The Order adapted. They faced moral dilemmas that required creativity beyond blades. They sometimes succeeded, sometimes failed. Through it all, the story of Kayn served as a compass. When they felt torn between decisive action and caution, they thought of how he balanced ambition and restraint. When they faced a being corrupted by power, they remembered his confrontation with the Swordbearer. When they had to mentor someone tempted by darkness, they drew on his dialogues with Rhaast. Years later, when Leanne was older and ready to pass on the Scythe, she gathered young acolytes and recounted her first conversation with Rhaast. She emphasized that the Scythe did not define its bearer, rather the bearer defined how the Scythe was used. She watched as one acolyte approached the weapon with both trepidation and determination. The cycle continued, far beyond the borders of Ionia. In a quiet tavern, an olden storyteller began. "Have you heard of the man who danced with shadows and fought alongside a spirit older than mountains?" The patrons leaned in. He spun the tale of Kayn, of his journey from child soldier to shadow master, of his travels, his internal battles, his mentorship, his death, and his legacy. He described the scythe that hummed with ancient life, the master who wielded it with both ruthlessness and mercy, the Darkin who learned to listen. When he finished, a young girl asked, "Was he real?" The storyteller smiled. "Does it matter? The lessons are real. In the end, the measure of a life is not only in deeds recorded in scrolls or songs. It is in the ripples those deeds create, in the minds changed, in the hands guided." Kayn's life, with its dualities and decisions, created ripples that continued long after his body returned to the earth. His willingness to engage with darkness without surrendering to it, his insistence on choosing his own destiny, his recognition of the humanity in those he fought. These ripples touched corners of Runeterra he never visited. They guided people he never met. They reminded a Darkin spirit that even immortals can learn. Perhaps Kayn sits on a stone by a river, watching petals drift by. Perhaps he listens to the stories told about him and smiles. Or perhaps he simply rests, content with the knowledge that his story will inspire others to seek their own path between shadow and light. In quiet corners of Runeterra, people sometimes claimed they saw a silhouette standing where shadow met light, watching with an unreadable gaze. Whether it was truth, imagination, or spirit did not matter. The presence of that figure reminded them of choices made in difficult times. It inspired farmers to stand up to bandits, sailors to spare prisoners, scholars to question dogma, and children to dream of paths that were neither wholly dark nor blindingly bright. In this way, Kayn's essence lingered not as a ghost chained to a weapon, but as a whisper of courage that moved through fields, cities, deserts, and tundra. His story, carried on the breath of those who repeated it, continued to shape lives quietly and profoundly. He remained a symbol across generations, bridging hearts everywhere. Long after the taverns closed and the mountains wore new crowns of snow, the tale of the Shadow Reaper passed into the rhythm of seasons. Artists painted scenes of a lone figure standing between sunlit fields and moonlit forests, suggesting that he was not a person, but a state of mind. In distant lands where neither Ionia nor Noxus held sway, philosophers took from his story lessons about choice and intention. They considered how to face the darkness in themselves without letting it consume them. One evening, a traveller paused by a river. She looked at her reflection and saw both strength and fear. She remembered the story of Kayn and the Scythe, of the choices he made, of how he refused to let others define his path. It was not the details of battles that mattered to her, but the spirit behind them. She chose to leave the path others had carved for her and to chart her own way. In that quiet decision, the legacy of Kayn lived on. In this way, legends intertwine with lives. Even when the names of the characters fade and the specific places blur, the essence of their struggles remains. The story of a child soldier who mastered shadows and conversed with an ancient weapon continues to offer guidance to those who seek a middle way. It teaches that even in a world of conflicting powers, a person can listen to the many voices within and still choose an authentic course for their journey. Its message endures in simple acts,